Hello and welcome to Making Media Now, the Filmmakers Collaborative podcast. I'm your host, Michael Azevedo. Over the past 50 years, boys and young men have steadily disengaged from school, work, and broader society. They're falling behind academically, struggling with loneliness and isolation, and facing rising rates of substance abuse and suicide. My guests on this episode are part of a team behind the compelling and eye-opening short documentary called Gone Guys. I'm joined by Chad Irvin, the film's director and producer, and by executive producer Lauren Curry of the Richard E. and Deborah L. Tarrant Foundation. The documentary draws on the influential work of writer and social scientist Richard Reeves. Reeves is the author of the 2022 bestseller of Boys and Men, which illustrates these challenges through powerful data and compelling personal stories. The documentary is set in rural Vermont and brings national data to life with engaging animation, accompanying lived experience, featuring young men, educators, mentors, and trailblazing programs that are working to re-engage boys and young men in their communities and reshape their futures. Here's the trailer.
It's not a fun thing, really, to be a young man right now. Like, there's a lot of criticism and there's a lot of isolation.
There are still a huge number of issues that we still need to tackle for women and girls. And there are a growing number of issues where we have to pay more attention now to boys and men, and we have to do both those things at once.
My experience in school, I got in trouble a lot. Went to the principal's office quite a bit. I felt very alone, and I just felt no one understood me.
So many of these kids that I've worked with who have trouble relating to school do just amazing things at home. What is it that we do in schools that causes that drive to learn to go away?
The gender gap in college degrees. In 1971-72, there was a 13 percentage point gap in favor of men. The catch-up was rapid. So there's now a bigger than Title IX level gender gaps in higher education now, but reversed.
This is the quiet conversation that educators have had for some time.
However we're preparing young people, it is not working as well for boys.
We also see this crisis among men playing out at a psychological level.
I just didn't really care about having a future. I was just like, whatever happens is gonna happen.
My father grew up with his father basically telling him, you're a man, men don't cry. So I just felt so, isolated.
A lot of men feel like they have quite a long list of things they know not to do. They don't have a very good list of things they should do.
What is taught, what is more focused on is what we're calling toxic masculinity.
We encourage men, go get engaged as a dad and talk about your feelings, but then we don't create those spaces.
I want to model what it should be to be not only a dad, but just a man in today's world, period.
Men aren't good about saying, I'm not doing well and I need to talk to someone. We have to be able to entertain that conversation of, we need to go get you some help.
I think sometimes things happen and they just continue to happen. And you don't sort of stop and say, oh, here's this trend. We can do something about it.
Nice job, Dusty. Yeah. Before you get frustrated, remember how much better you've gotten already, No, I gotta work on my firm handshake, bro. Woo!
All right, literally just get your firm.
If we don't want young men and boys to feel like the only people talking about the issues that are affecting them for real are those who are perhaps on the more reactionary side, whether it's left or right, but more reactionary, then it's up to us. That is our failing, not theirs.
Asking the question, what can you do tomorrow, is really important. It's not going to be one thing, it's going to be hundreds of things.
Making Media Now is sponsored by Filmmakers Collaborative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting media makers from across the creative spectrum. From providing fiscal sponsorship to presenting an array of informative and educational programs, Filmmakers Collaborative supports creatives at every step in their journey. To learn more, visit filmmakerscollab.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please do like, share, and follow. Now on to my conversation with Chad Irvin and Lauren Curry. Hello and welcome to Making Media Now. Chad Irvin and Lauren Curry. We're here to talk about a short documentary that both of you play a major role in called Gone Guys, produced by a company out of Vermont called Well Told Films. Chad is the director and the producer, and Lauren Curry is the executive producer of the film and also executive director of the Richard and Deborah L. Tarrant Foundation. So welcome to you both.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks. Great to be chatting with you. So I'd like to maybe start off by hearing from each of you, and Lauren, maybe we can start with you, around how this trend or this phenomenon or this crisis around young men and boys falling behind academically, struggling with loneliness and isolation, and, rising rates of substance abuse, of suicide, came to your attention, and how the foundations that you work for, and then maybe Chad, you as a storyteller and a filmmaker, felt like this is a story that needs to have a larger audience. This is a story that needs to be put into some type of a context. So, Lauren, maybe you could take that first.
The Tarrant Foundation, we're a private foundation serving primarily Vermont, and we spent 15, 16 years working on this issue, particularly through our education partnerships. So we've been worried for a long time about how are boys doing in school. What is it about school that seems to, not fit them as well, that makes it harder for them to participate in class, to, kind of tick the boxes that they need to tick, that we say they need to tick. So we spent a long time kind of directly engaging that issue by investing almost $12 million into Vermont's K-12 schools. And that effort was all about how do you create learning that's more hands-on, more engaging, and more relevant to today's learning.
About when in time did this take place?
So that started in our first strategic conversation started in 2005.
Okay.
And our key partner on that work was the University of Vermont's College of Education and Social Services. And so throughout that kind of direct intervention work, we were conducting research. How successful was this? What was it about different strategies that were more and less effective for students? And throughout that period, we had a particular research strand that was focused on boys and young men. So, we were learning that the outcomes that that those students were benefiting from kind of a different style of learning, more technology-based, more out of their seats, getting outside the classroom more, and, a bit less kind of learning in rows and taking tests. So, we were pretty encouraged by those results. And this was a big partnership. So we got into 85% of the schools in Vermont. We hit 2,000 educators with long-term partnerships. That's almost a third of our educator workforce. So, we felt like we really did a level of work that could be expected to achieve significant results. And did. And yet, the data in Vermont kept getting worse, and the data nationally kept getting worse. And for me, I'll say, so in 2005, when we began that partnership, I had just had my first child. And we've got a son and a daughter. Our daughter turns 18 today. Our son turns 20 next week. And my husband and I watched, my husband's a high school teacher, and we watched over those years, these two kids who come from the same home, have the same resources and support, modeling all of those things. We watched them have two fundamentally different experiences in the education system. And I think for me as a director, I spent a long time kind of thinking about, well, is it a boys problem or is it about personalization for all kids? All kids learn differently. And something happened to me as I was really kind of confronted by how this issue played out in my own house. And I was confronted by the data, because at one point, something like 5-6 years ago, Vermont hit a point where 70% of the students at the Community College of Vermont, which 10,000 kids a year, 10,000 kids and adults a year are served by, 70% of those students were female. And the University of Vermont hit 2/3 female. And to me, it was one of those things where I was like, I feel like I'm noticing these issues, I'm hearing personal stories, but to see data that so fundamentally spoke to a shift in one of our most essential systems was a real eye-opener.
Yeah.
And I'll turn it over to Chad, but I think also coupling that timing with the release of Richard Reeves's book, which made the conversation kind of accessible in a way that it really hadn't been before. That was the magic that came together to incentivize us to tackle this project.
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk about the work of Richard Reeves and the insights that he's provided for this conversation. But Chad, when you hear what Lauren has laid out, that can feel sort of unwieldy from a storytelling perspective. How did you come in there and as the storyteller and say, okay, well, it's got to be visual, and your film is really beautifully visually engaging, and it's got to be informative. So, how'd you take on that challenge?
Well, yeah, that does mirror very much some of our early conversations. I think I'm very prone of saying, okay, but what are we going to see?
Such a director.
Yes. Well, it was interesting when Lauren and Philippe reached out to us early on. This was a topic that it was something that I was interested in for a while as a man myself, and as a father of a son who is middle school age, which is this really critical period. It was very high on my priorities, and so, like Lauren said, being able to using Reeves's work in his one of the great things that his book is able to do is to frame this conversation with the data first, which sort of like everything in society now, everything ends up being super polarized. In this way, it sort of takes that out of the equation a little bit, where you can say, look at this. This is a problem. Here are the numbers that show what the problem is. And so one of the things that we started trying to do is the first thing that you might think you're going to do a film about, oh, we got failing schools, struggling, there's substance abuse, there's a suicide edge to this, deaths of despair. You'd be like, okay, let's go and we'll film in a troubled school and we'll follow around a student who's going through crisis and all of this sort of stuff. And I think it's a little bit different for us when we're making films. We're here in Vermont. It's a very small state. We're like 800,000 people in the whole state. So your approach when you're filming something this locally is you got to consider that these are your neighbors. So do I want to go and film a young man whose brain is still developing in terms of figuring out what the future consequences of this will be and put them on screen for their neighbors as in crisis or suffering from drug abuse or something like that. And then, it goes on and it lives on the web, possibly forever. We decided what we wanted to do is to look at some of these programs that were offering a little bit of hope, talk about the problem, but highlight visually the places we visited and the people we hear from are people who are making some sort of progress, are getting some sort of a foothold in this area so that we could leave a little bit of breadcrumbs as we go along through the story. So the viewer leaves not feeling like exasperated, like this is too big. There's nothing I can do. You've seen throughout the course of this that there are people making an impact, and I think it was very important to us. One of the problems that will happen to parents is when this was not being discussed much, it often felt isolating. You felt like it was a problem with your child, with children in your classroom as an educator. And to be able to point to this is a systemic problem is reassuring and empowering for people.
Yeah, and what comes across really vividly in the film is that, while it is Vermont specific in terms of the young men who you portray and the teachers and the mentors and community organizers and whatnot who you speak with, they're working with that community. The phenomenon or trend, it's a microcosm for something that's happening at a national level. And Richard Reeves, who we've spoken about several times already, your film draws heavily upon the influential work of Richard Reeves, who wrote a book, I think it came out in 2022, called of Boys and Men, which illuminates these challenges, through powerful and compelling personal stories. Lauren, could you give us a little bit more insight into who Richard Reeves is and how you came to be familiar with his work and felt that he was talking about something that you were already aware of?
He's an incredible guy. So Richard Reeves is, he is kind of a long-term thinker, speaker. He's been engaged in policy work, both in the US and in the UK, kind of throughout his career. And he actually came to Vermont, 7, 8, 10 years ago to speak about his work then, which was on kind of income class disparities, and his book called Dream Hoarders. So he came and he gave a presentation that, it was just he's a super engaging speaker. And I think from our work as a foundation, so, we're working along for a couple of decades. We're doing all of this direct intervention work. We're watching our research, and we're, continuing to learn from who are the folks out there who are writing about this issue. What are they finding? What are other programs that are working in partnership with schools finding? And, Reeves is far from the first. There have been many books written on this topic. I think something that happened with his book for me was he might describe it as he really specifically chose to be boring. He pursued the data first and foremost and comes back to the data. He certainly is willing to talk about it and what he thinks the data mean. But for him, the opportunity to kind of surface the data and bring them more into the common understanding was the mission. And that was a bit different than I think what we had seen from some other authors. And he very directly makes the statement that this is not a zero-sum issue. Caring more about boys and men does not mean caring less about women and girls.
Right.
And he is really keen on the idea of, how do we continue to support programs for women and girls? How do we learn from impactful programs for women and girls to create communities that are more healthy for us all? So he created this really interesting accessibility portal, that I think in the times that, I've had this conversation, with neighbors, with friends, Chad mentioned it, this can be a tricky conversation to have. And if you're experiencing these challenges in your own home, it can feel incredibly lonely. And there's this, I think, kind of hesitation in a world where we know that groups that have been less historically advantaged than men, particularly white men, that there's still so much work that needs to be done in support of those communities. It can be really a little frightening to say, and also we need to talk about, kind of what's happening for boys and young men.
Yeah.
And Reeves somehow had this kind of magic sauce where he made it okay to have the conversation. He made it okay to say the words. And I think he did that by really at the forefront keeping this idea about, facts. Like, the facts are what the facts are. We can all have opinions about them, but they are what they are.
Yeah.
And 2, compassion is one of our most valuable assets. We have the ability to care about one another. And on a human level, we have the ability to recognize that saying, well, I've got these 2 kids, but I'm only allowed to care about one of them. I'm only allowed to care about the challenges that one of them is having. with your parent hat on, that's ridiculous. Like you would just never do that.
Exactly.
So, he really asks us to kind of wear that same hat as a society and say, like, we have this capacity. We are able to think two things at once. We are able to care about more than one issue at a time.
So you mentioned that one of the ways Reeves gets around getting caught up in the minefield of language and polarizing terms, et cetera, is by leading with data that illustrates this trend, this crisis. Can you point to a couple of data points that feel particularly compelling and maybe illustrative of the thesis of your film?
Yeah, I mentioned the shift in college enrollment. For me, that was a big one because post-secondary education and training it's an essential. Whatever the level of the training is, if you want to pursue kind of certificates in the trades, you need to go on past high school. Mm-hmm. So to see so little take up among boys and young men with those opportunities, that to me was a real kind of eye opener. And I think then when I learned that the disparity, so the disparity that existed when Title IX was passed in 1972, the number of...
And just for our listeners' benefit, refresh our memories as to what Title IX accomplished.
So Title IX was a broad package of legislation that was about essentially opportunity for girls and women, and particularly in education spaces.
Yep.
And in 1972, when this huge kind of meta legislative package was passed, there was a 13 percentage point disparity in the college degrees that were attained by women versus men. Now, the disparity is between 15 and 16%. But it's the other way around. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that disparity equalized within 10 years or so of Title IX passing and then just kept going. And so Title IX was passed in part because we kind of took a look at those disparities and said, whoa, that is huge and not right. And it's going to take a large push for us to create better conditions. And we are not hearing anything like that now that the pendulum has swung the other way. That's just not a conversation that we're thinking about really. So that was a big one. And then I think, again, kind of on a human level and as a parent, as in someone who's engaged in my community, the suicide data are heartbreaking.
Yeah.
So 50,000 deaths by suicide in the United States in a year. 40,000 of those deaths are male.
Yes.
There's been a dramatic increase in male suicide since 2010. Rates among young men are up by a third. In Vermont, 80% of the suicides are male. And I had the experience as I was kind of working on this project of I collected a bunch of stories, before we made the film. I wanted to kind of get people talking about this, on the ground in communities. Like Richard coming in with his national lens was incredible, but we needed to ground this conversation here. Yep. So I collected all of these stories. And, when Richard presented his data on suicide, he presented all these age demographics and they started tracking at age 15. And way too many of the stories that I had collected wouldn't have been factored into those numbers because the kids were 12. They were 11 and ending their own lives. Mm-hmm. And that is something that is, that kind of moral imperative. We have to confront that. We have to sit with that reality, with what it means, and we've got to be willing to talk about what we can do about it.
Chad, can you talk to me a little bit about your approach in drawing out young men, men that perhaps aren't so young, maybe like they're in their 20s, they're in their 30s, as populate your film, to talk about a subject that is going to be uncomfortable, perhaps. It's going to require that they be vulnerable in a way that is not often applauded, particularly in the so-called manosphere, and we'll get into that in a bit. But you still, as we talked about earlier, you still want to make your film more about people than just, pie charts and graphs and so forth. So talk to me about that process for you and what your sort of kind of criteria was in terms of the types of story that you wanted to tell.
I would say that it was between myself and my producing partner, Angela Snow. I have to give Angela a lot of credit. She's between the two of us, there's a lot of texting, a lot of emailing, a lot of you reaching out through programs, and then through the programs you meet the boys. And then sort of try and establish a rapport and just sort of hanging out. It's always about developing trust. And for me, I think a lot of times, whether it's a person who speaks on policy level or a student, it's about being genuine and being authentic with the person in the moment. And to be honest, now I make documentaries. I've done quite a few of them and nice big ones. But I started out, I'm from a rural area of Appalachia. I was terrible student. I am a kid who had and still has, I'm not a kid anymore, but still has ADHD. And so between these things is, being able to have conversations with these guys and show vulnerability myself, say, I'm not perfect. I do happen to be the person here with a giant camera in your face, but this is a process that I've gone through also. And so with some of the guys, a lot of these guys are have ADHD is very highly diagnosed in young men now. And so to be able to talk with some of them authentically about, oh, hey, did this ever happen to you in class? Did you ever get in trouble for this? Oh my gosh, me too. You get that comfort going. And the other thing is just sort of time. It's always when you're filming, it's about people getting used to the camera being around.
Yep.
And we did take particular note of some of research that had been done in this area where uptake had been bad for boys, like say in a mentorship program where they were being mentored, and then you look at the data, you parse it a bit, and a lot of the mentors were female, and it came into this weird gender dynamics of where the men were less willing to be vulnerable in front of women. And so we as a crew took that into consideration. So it would be me and our director of photography, Spencer, and maybe like an audio person and like a few of these guys or one of these guys, and just having it's like a little conversation where you can be authentic and get to that point where you can feel like you can be a little bit vulnerable.
Can I take just 1 second to sing Chad's praises about this? So I have not made a movie before. This was an entirely new experience to me, being around these crews, watching these interviews unfold. And I have to say that something that Chad did that has really kind of blown me away is he made himself completely expert in the topic. From the time he was hired until we really began shooting, he consumed information. And I think part of what that did, he's like, yes, he's an incredibly, he's a personable guy and he's great to sit and talk to about this. But I think a huge part of that came from the fact that he was able to walk into these rooms. He wasn't doing homework as he went. He wasn't walking into those rooms just asking sort of a pre-scripted list of questions. He was coming at it from this place where the topic was so kind of fully bedded in that I felt like watching him work, you could see people who were sitting together in a space. And the space was the conversation. Chad wasn't kind of reaching for, what's my next question going to be? I'm not quite sure how this topic connects to the next thing. I felt like he approached all of these conversations as an expert and with this kind of this hat on of just wanting to learn from the people he was sitting with. So to me, it was really inspiring to watch. And I think from the film, some of the things these boys and young men were willing to talk about, some of the things they were willing to say, they wouldn't have said to someone else. I think they would have been much more hesitant to talk given a different set of circumstances. So, I feel like we kind of won the lottery in terms of the film team that we ended up working with all the way around. But, just huge, huge, huge credit to Chad, to Angela, to Well Told Films, to Spencer, to all of the folks who were involved in this project. They blew my socks off.
Yeah, and that comes through. That most definitely comes through in the film, through the sincerity and the empathy in the interviews. And I don't want to mischaracterize this. This film is nothing. It's nothing like a sob fest by any means. This isn't about a bunch of disgruntled people, venting their grievances by any means. It's illuminating. It's human. There's some humor in it, etc. I was going to ask just a bit ago, and this may be too broad or rudimentary a question, but I'm curious, when you were having these initial conversations with these men, young, old, in the middle, what were you getting as a sense of where their ideas came from around what it meant to be a man or to display masculine virtues?
Well, it's one of those things that, we try to convey this in the film, that I ask almost, if not every single person, I ask every person some variation of, what is healthy masculinity? Because I feel like it's one of those things that everyone says, there's this toxic masculinity and men need to do this and this and this. And, or what there isn't is like, so what does healthy masculinity look like? That's what I usually asked people, because it's like, it's all well and good to say men need to be better, but you don't really have a framework. What do I do then? And we heard this from everyone. The young men, the dads group we sat with was one of the first we filmed with. And like, people were often stumped. And so for me, when we sat down, we started making this, I was like, and we outlined at the very beginning, it's like, okay, this topic can easily balloon. So we make an outline of this is what we think we need to cover for this film to accomplish what we're setting out trying to accomplish, which is to be the beginning point for a conversation. And so really it needed to touch on the struggles of defining masculinity, and without. Let me think what I was going to say. And I mean, it's at every phase of it, there's you're wrestling with these contradictions. Sure. Where our high school boys talked about this. They're frequently getting pushed to encompass some of these more traditional sort of traits, strength and toughness and that sort of stuff. But then you need to be caring and you need to be open, and you see that all the way up through the dad saying, I'm being told I need to be a more engaged father and I need to be present in my family and I need to do all these things. But in the same time, their workplaces are not accommodating that. You're not getting time off for parental leave. You're not like, if I back in my editing days, I know there were times when I'm like, I have to leave at this time to go pick up my son from daycare, who's an infant. And like, I literally had people say, uncomfortably, but say, can't your wife do that?
Yeah. And there's that's mentioned in your film too. And, I think it's interesting. And I think it came across in the response that you just gave around, what's healthy masculinity? Healthy masculinity right now is sort of being defined as by what it's not. It's not toxic masculinity. Okay, well, what's toxic masculinity? Well, one definition of toxic masculinity is everything that was defined as masculinity up until maybe the last 25 years or so. So it really is this Rubik's Cube of terminology. And it often feels to me that so much energy and so much goodwill is really dissipated when people get lost at the level of just the terms and the language. I can recall many conversations where I was with people who, I would say we're all coming at a problem with well-intended ambitions. And yet, if anybody deviated from the approved glossary, which is often, maybe 3 months old, that you may not have brushed up on, then you're being labeled as the person that used the wrong word. And then therefore, you're being labeled as someone who is contrary to the goals of this mission. And one of the things I really liked about your film is that there is none of that. There's no labeling of ideologies or isms necessarily, but words are all we have to communicate. And so we do need to be able to use words with everybody acknowledging that we are well intended in the use of this language. If I use a word if I use it incorrectly, or if I use it in a way that is somehow offensive to somebody, let's talk about that. But let's not have that, shut down the conversation. Lauren, I'm wondering if you encountered any of those same kind of hurdles when you were talking about how best to have these types of conversations.
Absolutely. And I think, this is a case. So when Richard Reeves visited us in Vermont, we had, this almost killed me. We had this really epic April snowstorm. So the day he came here, we got something like 20 inches of snow. And, there was this huge kind of drama around, could we get him in? Would the airport be open? So I ended up kind of driving him around a lot in these crazy snowstorms. And we got all this time just kind of sitting in a car together. And I realized that one of the things that I found so particularly inspiring from him, and we talked about this a lot, was his facility speaking words, that he simply said the thing. Whatever the thing was, he didn't kind of, get it out through one's own discomfort, or try to swallow it back or try to couch it. In a way, he took the power out of a lot of those isms and a lot of those things that we've become afraid of by simply speaking the words.
Yeah.
And, that was a real lesson to me personally. And it's one that I know I still struggle with a bit. And, for me, particularly when it comes to, there's a lot of sensitivity around this. And I think that it's reasonable for us to be worried that we might make it harder for someone else to have the conversation with us, or harder for them to engage with what we're saying by a mischosen word. That's reasonable. But I think there is a lot of power in this idea of, if we're going to talk to one another about a topic that can be difficult, the first step is to talk to one another about that topic. It really is to show up in the conversation. And, I think I go back a lot to this idea of, if I'm centering in that conversation curiosity, I want to learn more about what's happening. I want to learn more about the ways this is impacting people. This is impacting all of us in society. That is a credible place to start. And I think if I am coming to those conversations with compassion for others, again, that is a credible place to start. And I just want to give a little shout out here to especially the young men and boys who are tackling this conversation themselves, who are asking these questions about, what does masculinity look like for me? And we met some of the groups that are working on this together. And through this project, we connected with this group at a school in a different part of Vermont, where a group of middle school boys work with, they come together, they formed a club with their teacher, and the club is called Boys Will Be ... And I love that. I love this idea that these boys are saying, okay, we know the boys will be boys thing. That doesn't work so well, but how do we, like, what is the ... for us? And there's something about, again, Richard Reeves talks about this as, like sort of how do you frame these conversations from a place. He credits the feminist movement with being a really optimistic space, that at its best, it was all about opportunity and, looking out for one another and forward momentum. And he really encourages us to have this conversation kind of from that same place, whereas I think a lot of versions of a conversation that's about masculinity, it's about toxic masculinity, is it's coming from the negative. It's coming from the what we don't want anymore, what we shouldn't see, what feels uncomfortable. But if we can find our way to a version of the discussion that is from that more optimistic place, the boys will be ... that gets me excited. Like, I want to know these kids. I want to know, what will you be? Yeah. How do you define this for yourself? And that's all an opportunities-based conversation, which feels exciting to me to have.
And as you made the point earlier that Reeves approaches this as underscoring that this is not a zero-sum game. In other words, it isn't that one side has to be entirely right all the time, the other side has to be wrong and the enemy. So in other words, you can be pro-female, a feminist, and also pro-boys and young men. In fact, being pro each of them is going to be to the benefit of both of them.
One of the earliest supporters of this project was, at that time, the director of the Vermont Women's Fund. Mm-hmm. A woman named Meg Smith, and she came forward really strongly in support of this on behalf of the Vermont Women's Fund, because, in her lens, what's good for women is kind of healthy, engaged, functioning men, that it is not good for women to have a growing pool of men who are disengaged, disconnected from school, from workforce, from family and community, growing sense of, kind of loneliness and isolation. That's not good for any of us. And she was also very rightly kind of championing the idea of, you want to know who can teach you about how to create opportunity engagement for populations that are feeling excluded? Like, we can. With the women's movement knows how to do that. Come learn with us. Right. Come learn some of the lessons that we've really taken to heart over the years, and we can kind of all boats can rise. And I think that's fundamental to this conversation.
Chad, in the film, there was a really interesting sequence that there was a discussion of kind of different learning styles of high school students, female versus male. And there was some conversation around how revisiting the value and the import of the trades, not just as work that needs to be done. And frankly, there's a shortage of talented tradespeople in the country right now, but also engagement in the trades provides a sense of identity. And a lot of times any population that, is at risk or seemingly without any real connections is because they really don't have an identity that allows them to say, this is my place in the world. But what I found really interesting, and I'm assuming it was purposeful, let me know if it wasn't, in the film is immediately following that sequence, somebody starts to talk about the astronomical suicide levels in the construction industry. And I'm wondering what you see the connection between the two being.
Yeah, that is I have to remember the exact stat. Is it for every, I think Reeves mentions this, is for every 3 deaths on a construction site that there are 5 by suicide?
Yes.
For every one. Yeah.
Yeah. This is why Lauren is here. I knew I would mess up some statistics. It's like, yeah. So, I mean, it's really shocking. And so,
but do we know in that instance, and I don't want to put either one of you on the spot. Do we know in that instance that the mental health problems that these men who had entered the construction field, were these mental health problems that became a byproduct of, of the work that they were doing, or do we think it's something that they've had for quite some time and they probably were never addressed because they never felt comfortable articulating the problems that they had?
I think drawing a causal relationship is tricky. Sure. I would say that I would characterize it more as this is like several overlapping Venn diagram circles where the construction industry is disproportionately working class male, which is more likely to have substance abuse and suicide. It's also disproportionately there's a high veteran population, which itself is higher suicide and substance abuse. And one of our guys who we talked to, who is actually we went to that scene. They looked here at these statistics and around substance abuse and suicide in construction, and they just said, we need to do something about this. And so this Association of General Contractors in Vermont started working substance abuse and suicide training into the general training, like the OSHA training that the guys were doing. And it's like, listen, we got to have this conversation, and the power of having the conversation in a way that is not preaching to people, but really just talking straight with them is really helpful. It's like, listen, we got to talk about this because it's a problem in our communities. So I think that's how I would think about it. Is more, it's just you've managed to isolate in this industry several different subgroups that are more have a higher rates of suicide and substance abuse.
Yeah, but I think you're making an important connection, which is, that sense of connection being a core issue. Yes, there's correlation with substance use. Yes, mental health issues, but often a suicide can present without any prior history of diagnosed or treated mental health disorder. I can't remember the statistic, but it's, a majority of men who die by suicide have not previously had an interaction with a mental health service in Vermont. And Dan Smith, who's the president of the Vermont Community Foundation, which is a core partner for us on this project, was citing a study of suicide notes. So what are the communications that people have left behind, and what's the vocabulary that's used in those communications? And there's this high prevalence of words like worthless and useless. It's not about, wow, my bipolar is, causing me issues today. It's not that. It's much more fundamental about human engagement. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where I go back to, if we can look at these issues from a compassionate place, that's a really important way to start.
I think that sometimes in a idealized, maybe somewhat utopian sort of Norman Rockwell vision of America, we would all say, well, young boys learn to become men by looking at the men around them, their dads and their teachers and their mentors and whatnot. And those conditions certainly do exist for some boys, but not a lot of boys, or perhaps not enough boys. And so therefore, what tends to happen or can happen is that other external voices, particularly now, begin to tell them what it means to be a man, what it means to be masculine. And quite often, those voices really have no interest in the healthy development of these young men. They're looking to sell something. They're looking to sell a book or a podcast or a film or, one thing or another. And they're really invested in the economics of division. If they can get that young man to think that they're not succeeding because the girl next door is, or because another, group is, those are conditions that, Chad, I'm going to guess when you were a young man, as tough as it might have been, you weren't dealing with those. And I can say the same thing as when I was a young man, which was prior to you being a young man. But, I wasn't dealing with those. And it just feels like the deck feels sometimes stacked against the voices of empathy, of compassion, and those who are simply looking to exploit. And I haven't even touched the whole social media, phenomenon. But when you were talking to either the boys or the other adult male figures who are in your film, were you hearing about these in terms of the almost ethical confusion that these young men are faced with?
Yes, I did. The young men spoke about it quite a bit in their engagement with it, and it is a completely different world for these boys and young men now than when I was younger. It was striking to me in hanging out with them, thinking I understood, but then hearing from them, it's like, wow, this is like I never had to confront things like this, right. And the realities of online dating, online socializing. It's a different world for them now, as it has been a different education system for them now. I picture my college classrooms were like 50-50 split in the late 90s, early 2000s. And now that's not the case. One of the boys of the college groups that we were with talked about, I'm a psychology major, so of course my class is almost all women. And I was just like, wait, what? I was a psychology major. It was not all women. But that sort of gets to another issue that there's a bunch of things we're not able to really dive into in the film, but the way that psychology and therapy professions have become more and more female as well. So that if you are one of these men suffering from a mental health crisis, there's less of a chance that you're going to be able to speak to a male therapist. But yeah. In terms of role models, there was a consistent theme from people that the people who were having success took the time to listen to what the boys said about themselves. And this was one of our guiding beliefs in the film, is that these young men are the experts in their own experience. Not our people who look at things from a statewide or a nationwide perspective. We want to hear, what does this mean to you? What is your experience of this? And the mentors that were having success were engaging genuinely with these boys, listening to what their priorities and their concerns were. But there's not enough of them. And it's falling on these teachers who are basically doing all of this work outside of the classroom or in addition to classroom work, trying to fill this void. And you spoke to the voices on online that are looking to benefit from this, and it gets back to something I think Lauren mentioned before: is there's a hesitancy to talk about this, and that has provided the space that those voices are the only voices. And so when people are afraid to engage in conversations about this from a helpful standpoint, from an encouraging standpoint, it leaves those as the only voices. There's a term for it. The Movember Foundation just did a really interesting study about this stuff, and it was interesting to hear, for me, why young men were watching these influencers in men and masculinity online, and a lot of them were engaging more from a standpoint of wanting connection. And also from a health standpoint, they were getting workout things. They were, and then so there's just this side helping of this sort of, sexism and that sort of stuff that was just added in there. It wasn't necessarily what got them engaged to begin with. And it's really interesting to think about. So that should be our guide point in saying this is what they're lacking. This is what they're seeking. what are some other ways that we all can help them find these things in other areas?
I mean, I think that your question started with this as, so you said, young men can look up to their dads or their teachers, but in 1980, 40% of the U.S. educator workforce was male. Today, that's 20%.
Yeah.
There's within 6 years of parents separating, a third of American children don't see their fathers again. So I think Chad is exactly right. A big reason that our foundation kind of got involved in this project, and the Vermont Community Foundation came with us, is this field exists. The conversation is going to happen. This topic will be discussed. And if we don't figure out what's the kind of civic version of that conversation to occupy some of that space, the radio jocks are going to have the whole field to themselves, and they're good at it.
Right. And Reeves' work, as I was reading, he points to starting initiatives that encourage men to join female-dominated fields. He calls them HEAL professions, which is an acronym, HEAL, healthcare, education, administration, literacy. But let's just talk about education for a moment. It is a female-dominated, particularly at the grammar school and the high school level, driven by economics for the most part, that the salaries of educators on par. If I can make more money, if my passion, say, is teaching social studies or English or science to grammar school kids, but I can make $25,000 more a year being the assistant account manager at a digital advertising firm that advertises hummus, I'm going to go for that job. I'm going to perhaps waste my potential. I'm going to perhaps waste the opportunity to reach the lives of other young men and be a mentor for them. So all of this is my awkward way of saying, as you've been rolling out your film and presenting it to different audiences, does the connection begin to come into focus around policy and economics? And how is that met by you guys and also by people who are viewing the film? I know it's a big question.
I would say one thing, and it is exactly an answer to your question, is one thing that seems to have been beneficial for some schools is to create alternative pathways into teaching. A lot of people do take that choice. I think that the decision starts sooner than when you're having the fork in the road. The decision happens when you're choosing a major in college, because teaching takes it's a postgraduate certification. So you're committing to like going to school as long as a doctor almost, slightly less, to go into education. So of some of the schools we talked with that had a lot of male teachers, like at the Oxbow High School here in Vermont, they had almost like a 50-50 split, I think, at the junior high level, or at high school level, I should say. And how they had done that is that men had gone into other types of work and then come to teaching later. And so I think that's one of those things that touches on policy is, okay, well, maybe you work in some other field for 10 years and then you're like, that was great, but I'm really finding value in working with young people. I would like to teach. And so decreasing barriers to getting a certification to teach later on, I think is a big thing.
Yeah. And the as we were talking about the trades earlier too, one of the points that came into my mind was, okay, so we encourage young men to go into the trades, and they go into the trades, and then they see that, okay, these trades are right now having to deal with unions are being decimated. You've got very powerful forces working against things like a living wage, et cetera. So what felt possibly like an alternative to despair and aimlessness now becomes a situation where it's sometimes a race to the bottom in terms of wages and so forth. So that illustrates or could illustrate an instance where somebody who sees your film agrees this is a crisis. Something has to be done about this, but they perhaps vote in a way that undermines the very effort at a socioeconomic level that is going to provide a greater opportunity.
The workforce development side of this, argument, I guess, for lack of a better term, is not the hard one to make. Right? Like that is the idea that we need more qualified workers ready to participate in a greater number of fields is a pretty easy sell at the business level, at the statewide level, because we know that we are struggling to hire workforce, especially in a state like Vermont, where, we are one of the fastest growing states in the nation. So I think from a policy standpoint, it's not that tricky for us to get things like a new creative approach to educator licensing kind of past the gates.
Mm-hmm.
I think for us, the policy challenge, so from our work with schools, starting in 2005, among the things that we studied a lot was how students in the 5th and 6th grade are making decisions about how they see themselves as vis-a-vis school. Like, am I a school kid or not? Is this for me or not? Do I think there's a path forward for me that education is going to support or not? They're in the 5th grade and they're making those kind of identity-based decisions. That's not so much about wage. That's not about, have I been exposed to the correct variety of career options? That's belonging.
Okay.
And the language that Richard Reeves uses to describe this is that there are spaces that are coding one gender or another, and that education is becoming a space that is coding female. So vast majority of the workforce is female. So, we all know, like, again, the power, the lessons that we learned from the feminist movement, like, you need to see someone like you who's doing a role in order to be willing to consider that role for yourself. And, there's all these data about, like, how many does it take? It's a different prospect to become a female engineer when 35% of the engineers are female versus when 20% are female. So if education, we've hit this point where 20% of the workforce is male, and where boys are overrepresented, what's called overrepresented at the tails. So the bottom 10% of GPA is 2/3 male. The top 10% of GPA is 2/3 female. So these spaces are coding as places where I don't see people in leadership positions like me. I'm not being taught by someone who looks like me. The system tells me I'm not going to succeed in it. And by the way, I am, X% more likely to be the one who gets in trouble and sent out into the hall.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering if young men feel like all of those points that you just made are factors in their lives, but also at the point of, maybe they want to find a partner in life. And, and I'm generalizing here, but does the average 25-year-old American female, given the opportunity to form a partnership with that high school history teacher versus the trader on Wall Street, who are they going to gravitate toward? Does this become a reinforcing sort of cycle of values? And again, it's a bit of a straw man proposition. So what I'm saying is, if the messaging is, guys, don't be limited by the caricature that the manosphere is presenting to you. But if I'm a young man developing and I see that caricature rewarded time and time again, that isn't helping me.
So Modern Love just tackled this. The Modern Love column in the New York Times. Okay. And there's this great piece, and the piece laments it's not, again, like it's not a wage-based consideration. It's a fade. So the author is writing about this kind of macro disappearance and disengagement of the men in her active dating life.
Okay.
And I think that, of course, like, do we make choices in our own life about partners that are based on things like what they do for a living? Of course we do, but also in that is like, and where do we live? And, did we meet one another in college or not? When did we have the opportunity to connect with one another? And, I think there's this narrative about, kind of the manosphere, like the people who are very successful at getting clicks and sponsorships in the manosphere, that says, that this is being held up as an example of, epitome of successful malehood. But I feel like what we learned from this film is when you take that conversation to some of the younger audiences, when you take that conversation to the boys who are in middle school and high school, it feels like they're trying to have a different version of it. It feels like they are not necessarily seeing themselves as being totally satisfied by that most extremist voice in their lives. Like they're seeking something deeper. They're seeking things like connection. There's a couple of them that talk about it. The boy picking tomatoes, the young man picking tomatoes in the film, how he kind of reflects on what it is to have this connection through the day, to do work that feels meaningful with people. It's just one of my board members said, like, God, it made me cry. Like I wrote that down. So I think again, it's when those are the only voices that are speaking on this subject. Yeah, they're really powerful. That's why I think it's so crucial to put forward pieces like this film that say, no, there's a different way to talk about this. There's a different level at which this discussion can take place. And it's much more human and much more productive.
So I want to hear a little bit about the response you're getting from audiences in your impact campaign rollout of the film. What's surprising you? What feels gratifying to you, particularly Chad, in the sense that being the filmmaker saying, oh, good, they got that. That's what I was hoping they would get.
We have our local premiere coming up on July 10th. So we have not shown to general audiences very much. We did screen ahead of time as like a test screenings with some people with varying levels of knowledge about the topic ahead of time to see, okay, are we like missing some sort of perspective? Is it landing? I think that for me, I really like one of my goals in the telling of this is I wanted to leave people with a bit of discomfort and uncertainty. A lot of people, they about halfway through the film, they were like, I'm ready. Let's get to work. Let's do this. Tell me what to do. And they kept waiting for that moment, and then it didn't happen. And they're like, oh, that's sort of intentional. Now it's up to me. Because the solution for a rural Vermont town, it's not going to be the same as the solution in Boston. It's not going to be the same solution in East Tennessee.
And it's not a singular solution.
Exactly. And it's often an interpersonal thing. I would say one of the funny things that happened to me was when you're working on a documentary, you tend to just become sort of wholly obsessed with the topic and drive everyone in your world crazy with it for we've been working on this a year and a half. People I imagine who are friends with me are going to be really glad when we're finished so I'll talk to them about something else. But like a year and a half, a little bit less than that ago, I started telling people people are, I do a weird line of work. So they're like, oh, so what are you working on now? And I would tell them, and you would get all the phases of the different things we've talked about, where it was like, oh, that's what you're doing a film on. Why? Because when we started working on this, it's become a lot more a widely discussed topic. But at that point, people are like, oh, wait, hold on. What's up with this guy? And then I would talk to them about the data a little bit. And I had some really interesting conversations with neighbors at like barbecues and stuff where they had like mothers around the same age as me, or at least in the same parenting phase as me, where we had children in like elementary-ish age who maybe had daughters and sons. And I know one woman is like the second or third time a mother said this to me that I just really like, oh, wow, this is noteworthy. She said to me, I grew up and my mother was one of these first people who like breaking through glass ceilings. And she came, and for us, it's like, you got to strive, you have to achieve in education, you have to push forward, you have to do this in your career and all this. And she's like, and I did. And I've turned around and I've been that same way with my daughter. And she's like, and standing here talking to you, I'm trying to think, am I that same way with my son?
Mm-hmm.
And so it really made me start to think about, what messages are we conveying to our sons? And I don't think it's intentional. I think that, this mother said, so, yeah. And soon after that, I ended up, my son who was in elementary school came home and said to me, oh gosh, it's college. It's so long and it's just so expensive. And I'm like, he's in elementary school. Why is like the point Lauren made earlier? It's where is this coming from? So I get sidetracked. I'm sorry.
No,
but
that's quite all right. I think what you're illustrating is that the conversations that your film is going to provoke are difficult to predict. But I think it's going to be, fascinating to see. I would love it if one or both of you would like to come back on the podcast a few months out after you've got some response and, again, talk to me about what surprised you, what you took heart from, and what you have been learning from the audiences that perhaps give you better insight as to what next steps might possibly be.
Yeah, I was going to say, Lawrence had some more longer discussions with some of the more general audience who's viewed some of our test screenings.
Great.
Well, I think very much in line with what Chad has experienced. People, what isn't surprising is that people can point to a boy or a young man in their life and do, so they watch this and they want to tell us about that kid. So that's a first response. And I think a second response is what they are blown away by is the significance of the data, that it's not anecdotal. It's not a few kids, that there's a sea change that's happening. And that's blowing some people away a bit. Mm-hmm. For me, I've really been gratified to see like how quickly the trailer has picked up steam, like how quickly the view count has risen. Like I work in the world of philanthropy. When we produce a video, like, I don't know, Vermont Community Foundation, there's a video on YouTube, it gets 56 hits or something like that over 10 years. And that is not what is happening here. So that's been really interesting. And when we watch the film, you said this is not a sob story. It's not. There are some really poignant moments in it. And I have so enjoyed kind of sitting and watching people watch those moments and get what I was like, oh, they've got the feelings, it's giving them the feelings. And I also really like it when they laugh at funny parts, because there are several really funny parts.
Yeah, no doubt there are. So, Chad, as you and I and Lauren were talking about before I hit record on this conversation, the film currently is not available for streaming. There's no theatrical run. You've got a rolling impact campaign for this, and perhaps the film down the line will be available, on a digital in a digital realm. But as Lauren just talked about, the popularity already of your trailer, which is only out in the world for under a week, if I'm correct, I think that portends to the popularity and the impact that the film is going to have. But in the interim, please share with listeners how, where they can go to find out more of the particulars about the film, and if this is an issue that is crucial to their community, to their work, to their life, how they might be able to have, host a screening or a showing.
Yeah, we have on our film site, on our website, goneguysfilm.com. We're going to continually update as we have new screenings. We're doing a lot of regional screenings that we're arranging right now, and are in 2 different festival announcements. And so we will consistently update that. And you can also sign up. Will be a newsletter with updates about whatever happens. And we also have a form if you're interested in showing this in your community or a group that you have, that you can sign up, and we're going to create a efficient system for getting to answering those questions. But all on the website, that would be the place to go.
Fantastic. Well, I had asked you both for about 30 to 40 minutes. We've talked for well over an hour, and I could go on and on, but I'm going to let you get on with the rest of your day. We've been talking about this great short documentary called Gone Guys, and I've been speaking with the director and producer of the film, Chad Irvin, and the executive producer of the film, Lauren Curry. Go to goneguysfilm.com to find out more. I'll make sure that all this information is in the program notes for this podcast episode. Thank you both very much for your time and for this really important and really well-made film.
Thank you, Michael. It's been great.
Thanks so much, Michael. Really appreciate it.